sign this divorce paper and never return to my home.
Please, don't leave me.
She was in active labor, screaming through contractions, when he walked in with divorce papers and his mistress. Sign it, Emma. You were always beneath us, and now everyone will see it. Through tears and unbearable pain, she signed, while he smiled, believing he'd finally erased the worthless woman who'd embarrassed his family for 5 years. But what happened 3 months later would wipe that smile off his face forever and leave him begging for mercy he'd never shown her. Hello, beautiful soul. Welcome back to my channel. We're at 9K subscribers, and my mom said we'll never hit 10K this new year. I told her she's wrong, that I have a beautiful family here who believes in these stories. So before we start, prove her wrong. Subscribe right now, turn on notifications, and comment where you're watching from. Let's hit 10K together and show her what this family is made of. Now let's dive in. Emma's breath caught the moment the car passed through the iron gates. The estate rose before her like something out of a dream she didn't dare have, all towering marble columns and windows that reflected clouds like they owned the sky itself. Her hands gripped the edge of her seat as the driver navigated the circular driveway, and she told herself this was the beginning of something beautiful. She'd married Elliot 3 weeks ago in a small ceremony his mother had called intimate, but Emma knew meant unworthy of announcement. Still, she'd come here with hope stitched into every breath, believing that patience and humility could earn her a place in this world of wealth and power. She was about to learn how wrong she was. The car stopped. The driver opened her door without meeting her eyes, and Emma stepped onto gravel that crunched like broken promises beneath her shoes. Before she could take in the manicured gardens or the fountain centerpiece that probably cost more than her father earned in a lifetime, the grand doors swung open and Margaret appeared. Elliot's mother stood framed in the entrance like a portrait of elegant disdain, pearls gleaming at her throat, her silver hair swept back so tightly it looked painful. Her smile was cold and perfect. "Welcome, Emma," she said, and the way she pronounced the name made it sound like an apology. "How fortunate you are." Emma opened her mouth to respond, to say thank you, or perhaps to explain that she was grateful, truly grateful, but Margaret had already turned away, heels clicking against marble floors that echoed with the sound of dismissal. Emma followed her inside, and the doors closed behind her with a finality that felt like a trap snapping shut. The foyer stretched impossibly high, all crystal chandeliers and oil paintings of stern-faced ancestors who seemed to judge her from their gilded frames. Margaret gestured vaguely at the space, as if Emma should simply absorb centuries of breeding and wealth through proximity. "Elliot is handling business matters," she said, without looking back. "You'll meet the family properly at dinner tonight. I trust you remember how to conduct yourself at a formal table." The question hung in the air like an accusation. Emma's throat tightened. Of course she managed, though her mind was already racing through the YouTube videos she'd watched on formal dining etiquette, the desperate hours she'd spent trying to memorize which fork went where and how to hold a wine glass she'd never be comfortable holding. Margaret's lips pressed into something that might have been a smile on someone warmer. "We shall see," she said, and walked away, leaving Emma standing alone in that cavernous space, feeling smaller than she'd ever felt in her life. That first dinner was a masterclass in cruelty disguised as civility. 8 family members gathered around a table designed for 20, and Emma sat beside Elliot, who kissed her cheek without warmth and immediately turned his attention to his uncle's discussion about stock portfolios. She smoothed her dress, the nicest one she owned, and felt the weight of every eye assessing her like appraisers evaluating furniture at an estate sale. The whispers started before the first course arrived. "Did you see her shoes?" Elliot's sister Caroline murmured to their cousin, her voice just loud enough to carry. "Clearance rack, I'd wager. Poor thing probably thinks they're designers." Laughter rippled down the table, soft and vicious. Emma's face burned, but she kept her expression neutral, reaching for her water glass with a hand that trembled just slightly. Elliot said nothing. He reached for his wine, swirled it, took a sip, and acted as if his wife wasn't being dissected 3 feet away from him. Margaret sat at the head of the table, like a queen presiding over her court, and when the appetizers were served, she turned her attention to Emma with the precision of a surgeon selecting where to cut. "Emma, darling, do tell us about your family. Your father worked in construction, didn't he?" The table fell silent. Every fork paused midair. Emma felt her pulse in her throat. "Yes," she said, keeping her voice steady. "He built homes. He was very skilled." Margaret nodded slowly, as if considering something distasteful but necessary. "How noble. Manual labor is certainly honest work. And your mother, she was a teacher, wasn't she?" Emma's fingers tightened around her napkin beneath the table. She taught elementary school for 23 years. She loved children. Margaret's smile didn't reach her eyes. "How quaint," she said, and the word landed like a slap. "It's refreshing to see someone from such humble beginnings adapt to our way of life. Though I imagine it must be quite overwhelming for you, all of this." She gestured at the opulence surrounding them, as if it were a burden Emma couldn't possibly understand. "Have you ever sat at a table where every word felt like a test you were designed to fail? Where smiles hid knives and compliments concealed contempt?" That's what Emma endured that night, and it was only the beginning. The courses came and went, each one an opportunity for another small humiliation. When Emma hesitated over which spoon to use for the soup, Caroline leaned over with mock concern. "It's the round one, dear. The round one. We all had to learn sometime, I suppose." When Emma complimented the wine, Margaret's brother chuckled and said, "I wouldn't expect you to recognize a 1982 Bordeaux, but it's lovely that you're trying." And through it all, Elliot said nothing. He ate his meal, participated in conversations that excluded his wife, and acted as though the woman he'd married 3 weeks ago was invisible. After dinner, Emma found herself alone in the hallway, staring at a portrait of some long-dead patriarch whose eyes seemed to follow her with the same judgment the living family members had shown. She heard footsteps and turned to find Elliot approaching, his phone in his hand, his expression distracted. "They're warming up to you," he said without conviction. Emma stared at him, searching for some sign that he'd witnessed the same evening she had, that he'd heard the cruelty wrapped in politeness, the contempt dressed as concern. "Your mother called my family quaint," she said quietly. "Your sister mocked my shoes. Your uncle laughed at me for not recognizing expensive wine." Elliot sighed, the sound heavy with irritation, as if Emma was being unreasonable by noticing her own humiliation. "You're being too sensitive," he said, still looking at his phone. "They're just getting to know you. Give them time." He walked past her then, leaving her standing alone in that hallway. And Emma felt something shift inside her chest, something that felt like hope dying and being replaced by something colder, harder, more aware. The weeks bled into months, and the pattern repeated itself with soul-crushing consistency. Every family gathering brought fresh humiliation. Sunday brunches where Margaret would pray aloud for the grace to accept those less fortunate into our family with patience and love, her hand gripping Emma's, as if she were a charity case requiring salvation. Afternoon teas, where Caroline would offer fashion advice with a sympathetic smile. "You'd look so much better in tailored pieces, Emma. I know a stylist who works with all kinds of people. She's very patient." All kinds of people. The words echoed in Emma's mind long after they were spoken. She smiled. She thanked them. She played the role of the grateful, humble bride who knew her place, but inside she was cataloging every insult, every dismissive glance, every moment of calculated cruelty. She didn't know why yet, but some instinct told her to remember everything. Elliot grew more distant with each passing week. He came to bed later, smelling of perfume that wasn't hers. When she asked about it, he'd accuse her of paranoia, of being insecure, of not trusting him. "You're imagining things," he'd say, his back already turned to her in their massive bed. "Maybe if you focused less on perceived slights and more on fitting in, you'd be happier here." Emma would lie awake in the darkness, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of her isolation pressing down like a physical thing. She'd married a man who was supposed to protect her, who'd promised to stand beside her, but he was nowhere to be found when she needed him most. Instead, he was becoming an echo of his mother, cold and distant, measuring Emma's worth by standards she could never meet. One evening, Emma walked alone through the estate gardens, desperate for air that didn't taste like judgment. The hedges were trimmed to geometric perfection, the imported roses arranged in patterns that probably had Latin names, and everything was beautiful in the way that only money could make things beautiful, artificial and maintained and utterly soulless. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of amber and blood, and Emma felt the full crushing weight of her reality settle over her. She'd come here believing that love could bridge any gap, that patience and humility would earn her acceptance. But all her humility had done was give them permission to treat her as inferior. All her patience had bought her more time to be diminished. What would you do if the people who promised to love you made you feel worthless every single day? If your husband became a stranger and his family treated you like a stain they couldn't scrub away? Emma stood in that perfect garden, surrounded by beauty built on generations of wealth, and felt something crystallize inside her, something sharp and clear and unbreakable. She would survive this. She would endure every insult, every dismissal, every moment of isolation. She would watch and listen and learn the patterns of their cruelty, because somewhere deep in her bones, she understood that patience wasn't weakness. It was preparation. And one day, every person who'd underestimated her would understand exactly who she was and exactly what they'd lost by treating her as less than human. The air turned cold and Emma wrapped her arms around herself, walking back toward the house, where warm light glowed through windows that promised comfort, but delivered only more pain. But she walked back anyway, head high, because that's what survivors do. They endure. They adapt. They learn to become invisible while seeing everything. And Emma had already learned the most important lesson of all. In a house full of people who believed wealth equaled worth, her humility wasn't her weakness. It was her disguise. Behind it, she was watching, cataloging, and preparing for something none of them could see coming. She was very, very good at waiting, and she had just begun to understand that patience, when wielded correctly, could become the most devastating weapon of all. 5 years. 5 years of enduring cruelty, so subtle that if Emma tried to explain it to anyone outside that house, she'd sound paranoid. 5 years of family dinners where prayers became weapons and concern masked contempt. The insults arrived in perfectly wrapped packages, delivered with smiles that never reached anyone's eyes, and Emma had learned to unwrap each one carefully, examining the damage before storing it away in the growing catalog of evidence that lived inside her mind. Because that's what it had become, evidence, proof of a systematic campaign to break her spirit without ever raising a voice or leaving a visible mark. They were destroying her slowly, and the worst part was that Elliot had stopped pretending to care. Year 1 had been about adjustment, they'd said. Emma's still learning our ways, Margaret would announce at gatherings, as if Emma were a foreign exchange student struggling with basic customs rather than a woman with a college degree and a functioning brain. Year 2 brought speculation about children. Still nothing. Margaret asked one Christmas morning, her hand resting on Emma's flat stomach with a presumption that made Emma's skin crawl. Perhaps it's stress. Or perhaps some women simply aren't built for motherhood. My grandmother used to say that breeding shows in everything, even fertility. The words hung in the air like poison, and around the table, family members nodded sympathetically while their eyes gleamed with something else entirely. Emma smiled through it all, her face a mask she'd perfected, while inside she filed away another entry in her mental record. Christmas 2019, Margaret questions fertility, suggests inferior breeding. Year 3 was when the rumors started. Emma would walk into rooms and conversations would stop mid-sentence, resuming only after awkward pauses filled with meaning she wasn't supposed to understand, but absolutely did. I heard she's seeing a therapist, Caroline whispered to her mother one afternoon, not quite quietly enough. Depression, apparently. I suppose it runs in families like hers. Emma had been standing just outside the drawing room, frozen in place, listening to them dissect her mental health like physicians discussing a patient they found distasteful. She never mentioned a therapist again, never gave them the satisfaction of knowing they'd discovered her one outlet for processing the daily psychological warfare. Instead, she canceled her appointments and learned to compartmentalize her pain so efficiently that even she sometimes forgot it was there, buried beneath layers of practiced endurance. By year 4, Elliot had stopped touching her entirely. They shared a bed in name only, him on his side, her on hers, a gulf of expensive sheets between them that might as well have been an ocean. He'd come home late smelling of perfume and wine, and when Emma asked where he'd been, he'd look at her with something close to disgust. Business dinner, he'd say, or client meeting, or sometimes just out. One night she pushed harder, desperate for some acknowledgement that their marriage still existed. Elliot, please, just talk to me. Tell me what I did wrong. Tell me how to fix this. He'd turn to her then, his face illuminated by the glow of his phone, and his expression was so cold it took her breath away. You want to know what you did wrong? You exist, Emma. You exist in a world you don't understand, with people who will never accept you, and instead of having the dignity to recognize that, you keep trying. It's exhausting to watch. The words hit her like physical blows, each one precisely aimed at the parts of her that still hoped things could get better. Have you ever loved someone who made you feel like your very existence was a burden? Who looked at you with disappointment so profound it felt like hatred? That's what Emma lived with every day, and it was killing her in ways that wouldn't show up on any medical exam. But she didn't break. She bent, she absorbed, she endured, and she remembered everything. Every insult at every gathering, every dismissive comment, every moment when Elliot chose his family's cruelty over his wife's humanity. She kept a mental ledger, so detailed that years later she'd be able to recall exact dates, exact words, exact witnesses to each act of psychological violence. She didn't know why yet, but the compulsion to document was overwhelming, as if some part of her understood that all this suffering would one day serve a purpose beyond simple survival. Year 5 brought a shift so subtle Emma almost missed it. Margaret's cruelty, once disguised as concern, became more direct. I told Elliot when he married you that this would be a mistake, she said one morning over breakfast, her voice casual as if discussing the weather. But he insisted you had potential. I suppose we all make errors in judgment. Emma set down her coffee cup carefully, her hands steady despite the rage burning in her chest. I'm still here, Margaret, she said quietly. Despite everything, I'm still here. Margaret's smile was razor sharp. Yes, dear, you are. The question is why. The implication was clear. Emma was staying for the money, for the lifestyle, for access to a world she didn't deserve. The truth was far more complex, but Emma had learned that truth didn't matter in this house. Only perception mattered, and they decided long ago who she was. The family gatherings became increasingly unbearable. At Easter dinner, Margaret led a prayer that made Emma want to scream. Lord, we thank you for bringing all types of people into our lives, even those who challenge us to practice patience and Christian charity. Help us to love those who are different from us, those who don't share our values or our breeding, and give us strength to guide them toward better understanding. Emma kept her head bowed and her eyes open, staring at her plate while every word carved another piece out of her dignity. When the prayer ended, everyone said amen except her. She stayed silent, and Margaret noticed. Emma, dear, is something wrong? You didn't say amen. The entire table was watching. Emma looked up, met Margaret's eyes, and smiled. I was thinking about how blessed I am, she said softly, to be surrounded by such devout family members. The sarcasm was so faint it could have been imagined, but Margaret's eyes narrowed just slightly, and Emma felt a small, bitter satisfaction. She was learning to fight back in their language with subtlety and implication, and it felt like the first real power she'd claimed in 5 years. Elliot's distance had evolved into something worse than neglect. It had become active avoidance. He traveled more frequently, stayed later at the office, and when he was home, he treated Emma like furniture, something to move around but never acknowledge. One evening, Emma confronted him in his study, where he sat surrounded by leather and mahogany and the trappings of inherited wealth. Are you having an affair? She asked directly, tired of dancing around the obvious. Elliot didn't even look up from his laptop. Does it matter? The question stunned her into silence. Does it matter? She repeated, her voice rising. I'm your wife. Yes, it matters. Elliot finally looked at her, and his face was utterly blank, devoid of any emotion that might suggest he'd once loved her. My wife, he said slowly, as if tasting the words and finding them distasteful. You're my wife on paper, Emma. That's all you've ever been. That's all my mother would allow you to be. And honestly, I'm tired of pretending otherwise. What do you do when the person you married admits they never really saw you as human? When they confirm every fear you've been too afraid to speak aloud? Emma stood in that study, feeling her world collapse in on itself. And for the first time in 5 years, she let herself acknowledge the truth. This marriage was never going to get better. Elliot was never going to protect her. His family was never going to accept her. She was alone in this house, and she had been from the very beginning. But instead of breaking her, this realization did something unexpected. It freed her. Because once you stop hoping for rescue, you can start planning your own escape. The final months of year 5 brought an unexpected development. Emma missed her period. Then another. The pregnancy test she took in a bathroom she'd locked 3 times showed 2 pink lines that felt more like a life sentence than a blessing. She was carrying Elliot's child. A child who would be born into this family of vipers. A child who would either become one of them or suffer the way Emma had suffered. The thought terrified her. But it also clarified something crucial. She couldn't leave. Not now. Not when a child's future was at stake. She needed to stay, to endure, and to find a way to protect this baby from the cruelty that had defined her own experience. When she told Elliot about the pregnancy, he stared at her for a long moment, then said 4 words that would echo in her mind for months. Are you sure it's mine? The accusation, so casual and devastating, revealed exactly how far their marriage had deteriorated. Emma didn't cry. She didn't defend herself. She simply walked out of the room, went to her bedroom, and sat in the darkness, one hand resting on her still flat stomach. She made a promise to that tiny cluster of cells. I will survive this for you. I will endure whatever comes next. And I will make sure that everyone who underestimated me, everyone who treated me as worthless, everyone who thought I was too weak to fight back, will one day understand exactly what they created when they spent 5 years trying to break me. Because pain, when stored and cataloged and remembered with perfect clarity, doesn't disappear. It transforms. And Emma was about to discover that her transformation had already begun, triggered by a pregnancy that would either be her salvation or her final humiliation. Emma's pregnancy should have changed everything. Instead, it made everything worse. Her body, once her own to control, became public property for the family's scrutiny and judgment. Margaret's first response to the news wasn't congratulations, but inspection, her eyes scanning Emma's still flat stomach with a clinical assessment of someone evaluating livestock. Well, she said after a long pause, I suppose we'll see if you can carry it to term. These things can be delicate for women of certain backgrounds. The implication hung in the air like smoke, suffocating and impossible to escape. Certain backgrounds. As if Emma's DNA itself was suspect, as if her body might fail at the one biological function that even her cruel family couldn't deny her. Emma placed a protective hand over her stomach and said nothing, already understanding that this child she carried would become another weapon they'd use against her. Another opportunity to remind her of her perceived inadequacy. Elliot's reaction was worse than his mother's. When Emma told him the pregnancy test was positive, he was in his study, scrolling through his phone with the detached interest of someone reading weather reports. He looked up, his face blank. I assume you'll be moving into the guest wing, he said flatly. Pregnant women need rest, and I can't afford to have my sleep disrupted. Not our baby, or this is wonderful, or even a pretense of shared joy. Just a logistical problem to be solved through separation. Emma felt something inside her chest crack open. Elliot, this is your child, she said, hating how her voice trembled. Our child. Doesn't that mean anything to you? He set down his phone with deliberate care and looked at her with eyes that held no warmth, no recognition, nothing that suggested he remembered ever loving her. What it means, Emma, is that you've complicated things. Again. He stood, walked past her without another word, and Emma stood alone in that study, one hand on her stomach, realizing that she would face this pregnancy entirely alone despite being married and living in a house full of people. The first trimester brought nausea, so severe Emma could barely keep water down, but sympathy was nowhere to be found. Margaret would watch her rush from the breakfast table with thinly disguised contempt. My pregnancies were effortless, she'd announce to whoever was listening. I never experienced morning sickness. But then again, I come from hardy stock. Caroline would nod in agreement, adding her own stories of friends who'd sailed through pregnancy without a single complaint. It's all about constitution, she'd say, dabbing her lips with a linen napkin. Some women are simply built for motherhood and others struggle. Emma would return to find them still discussing her weakness, her inadequacy, her failure to perform pregnancy with the grace they deemed appropriate. She'd sit back down, force herself to eat toast that tasted like cardboard, and catalog every cruel word for later. Then Elliot brought her to the family gathering. The woman was stunning in that effortless way that money could buy, all glossy hair and designer clothes, and a smile that knew exactly how beautiful it was. Her name was Victoria, and Elliot introduced her as a business associate, but the way his hand lingered on her lower back told a different story. The way Victoria's eyes swept over Emma, taking in her slightly swollen stomach and pale complexion with barely concealed satisfaction, confirmed what Emma already knew. This wasn't just an affair. This was a replacement, publicly displayed, a message delivered with surgical precision. Margaret welcomed Victoria with more warmth than she'd ever shown Emma in 5 years. How lovely to finally meet you, Margaret said, air-kissing both of Victoria's cheeks. Elliot has told us so much about your work together. The emphasis on work was almost playful, as if they were all in on a joke that only Emma was too stupid to understand. Have you ever had to sit across from your husband's mistress and pretend everything was normal? To watch your mother-in-law treat the other woman with the affection she'd always denied you? Emma endured that dinner in a state of surreal horror, watching Victoria charm the family with practiced ease, watching Elliot look at another woman the way he'd once looked at her during their brief courtship. Every laugh they shared felt like a knife between Emma's ribs. Every knowing glance between Elliot and his mother confirmed what Emma had suspected. This had been planned. Victoria wasn't just a mistress. She was the future, the woman they'd wanted Elliot to marry, the one who belonged in ways Emma never would. And the cruelest part was that they weren't even trying to hide it anymore. After dinner, Emma found herself in the garden again, her sanctuary of roses and manicured lawns. But this time, she wasn't alone. A man in his 60s approached carefully, his kind face creased with concern. Mrs. Thompson, forgive the intrusion. I'm Robertson, a friend of your late father. Emma turned, surprised. She'd never heard her father mention anyone from this social circle. My father. Robert nodded, his expression gentle. We worked together on a construction project years ago. He was a good man, and I've always kept an eye on his daughter from a distance. I hope you don't mind my saying this, but what I witnessed there tonight was unconscionable. Emma's throat tightened with unexpected emotion. After 5 years of isolation, having someone acknowledge her suffering felt like oxygen to a drowning person. I don't know what you mean, she said automatically, the defensive lie she'd perfected. Robert smiled sadly. Yes, you do. And I want you to know that not everyone is blind to what's happening here. Some of us see exactly who you are and exactly how you're being treated. He handed her a business card, simple and elegant. If you ever need anything, legal advice, financial counsel, or simply someone who will tell you the truth, please call me. You're not as alone as they want you to believe. Emma took the card with shaking hands, tucking it into her pocket like contraband. Robert left as quietly as he'd arrived, and Emma stood in the darkness, feeling the first stirrings of something she hadn't felt in years. Hope. Not the naive hope she'd arrived with, but something sharper and more dangerous. Strategic hope. The hope of someone who was beginning to understand that endurance alone was enough. She needed allies. She needed information. She needed to start building something invisible that could withstand the coming storm. Victoria became a permanent fixture after that night. She appeared at family brunches, holiday gatherings, even casual dinners. Each appearance was a calculated humiliation, a reminder that Emma was disposable, already replaced before she'd even been discarded. And the worst part was how much Victoria seemed to enjoy it. One afternoon, Emma encountered her in the hallway, and Victoria stopped, her smile sharp. "You must be so uncomfortable," Victoria said with mock sympathy. "Pregnancy is hard enough without all this family drama. But don't worry, once the baby comes, things will settle. Elliot will have his heir, and you'll have, well, whatever it is you need." The message was clear. Emma's usefulness would end the moment she delivered. She was an incubator, nothing more. Emma met Victoria's eyes and felt rage so pure it took her breath away. "Whatever I need," Emma repeated softly. "Yes, I'll make sure I have exactly what I need." Victoria's smile faltered just slightly, as if sensing something she couldn't quite name, before she walked away. That night, Emma called Robertson. They met at a quiet cafe far from the estate. And for the first time in 5 years, Emma told someone the truth. All of it. The systematic humiliation, the prayers that were weapons, Elliot's coldness, Victoria's presence, the feeling of being erased while still breathing. Robert listened without interruption, taking notes on a legal pad, his expression growing grimmer with each detail. When Emma finished, he sat back and looked at her with a mixture of admiration and concern. "You've been documenting all of this?" Emma nodded. "In my head. Every date, every incident, every witness." Robert smiled. "Then you're smarter than they think. And that's going to be to your advantage. Mrs. Thompson, I'm going to help you, but you need to understand something. The battle ahead won't be loud or dramatic. It will be quiet, strategic, and it will require patience. You might think you don't have left." Emma placed her hand on her stomach, feeling the flutter of movement that had started just days before. "I have all the patience in the world," she said. "I've been training for this for 5 years." The second trimester brought physical changes that made her pregnancy impossible to hide. Her stomach rounded, her face softened, and her body became undeniable evidence of the child she carried. But instead of protection, her visible pregnancy brought intensified cruelty. At a family dinner, Margaret looked at Emma's plate and clicked her tongue. "You're eating for 2, dear, not 20. We wouldn't want you gaining unnecessary weight. Elliot's child should be born healthy, and that requires discipline." Emma set down her fork, her appetite gone. Across the table, Victoria watched with amusement while Elliot stared at his phone, uninvolved and uncaring. Emma excused herself, went to the bathroom, and stared at her reflection in the mirror. Her face was pale, her eyes shadowed with exhaustion, but beneath the surface, something harder was forming. She was tired of being the victim in this story. Robertson was gathering evidence. She was building an invisible case. And somewhere in the future, she couldn't quite see yet, there would be a reckoning. What would you do if you knew the people who wanted you gone were underestimating you? If every insult they delivered gave you more ammunition for the fight they didn't know was coming? Emma splashed water on her face and made a decision. She would stop hoping for mercy or fairness or love from people incapable of giving it. Instead, she would prepare. She would endure this pregnancy surrounded by enemies. She would give birth in a hospital where her husband would probably arrive late if he arrived at all. She would face whatever final humiliation they had planned. And then, when they least expected it, when they thought they'd finally broken her completely, she would show them exactly what 5 years of patient suffering had built. The contractions started earlier than expected, sharp and sudden, pulling Emma from sleep at 3 in the morning. She called for help, but the house was dark and empty, everyone asleep or deliberately absent. Emma made it to the hospital alone. In a taxi, she called herself, her overnight bag clutched in one hand and Robertson's business card in the other, knowing that the final test was beginning and that everything she'd endured had been preparation for whatever came next. The hospital room was cold and sterile, all white walls and beeping machines that measured Emma's pain in electronic intervals. She'd been in labor for 6 hours, alone except for the nurses who checked on her with professional sympathy that somehow made the isolation worse. Each contraction felt like her body was trying to tear itself apart. And through the haze of pain, Emma kept checking her phone for messages that never came. Elliot knew she was here. She'd called him at 4 in the morning, her voice tight with pain, and he'd said he'd come soon. That was 6 hours ago. The nurses exchanged glances when they thought Emma wasn't looking, their expressions revealing what they wouldn't say out loud. They'd seen this before, women laboring alone while husbands remained conspicuously absent, and it never ended well. At hour 7, the door opened and Emma's heart lifted with desperate, foolish hope. But it wasn't just Elliot. Margaret walked in first, her presence filling the room like a cold front, followed by Victoria, who wore a sympathetic smile that didn't reach her eyes, and finally Elliot, who looked annoyed at being summoned. Emma's mind struggled to process what she was seeing through the fog of pain. Her husband had brought his mistress to watch her give birth. Her mother-in-law, who'd spent 5 years making Emma feel worthless, stood at the foot of the bed like a judge preparing to deliver a sentence. "What's going on?" Emma managed, her voice hoarse from hours of controlled breathing. Another contraction seized her, stealing her breath, and she gripped the bed rails until her knuckles turned white. When the pain subsided enough for her to focus again, she saw Elliot reaching into his jacket pocket with deliberate slowness, like someone performing a rehearsed action. He pulled out an envelope, expensive cream-colored paper that matched the rest of his polished life, and from the envelope, he extracted a document. Emma's vision blurred with exhaustion and pain, but she could make out enough words to understand. Divorce agreement. Elliot set the papers on the rolling table beside her bed, then produced a pen from his pocket. Not just any pen. A golden fountain pen, the kind that cost more than most people's monthly rent, its surface gleaming under the harsh hospital lights like a trophy. "Sign these," Elliot said, his voice flat and businesslike, as if he were concluding a contract rather than ending a marriage while his wife labored to birth his child. "Sign them now, and this can be over quickly." Emma stared at him, trying to find some trace of the man she'd married, some flicker of humanity or guilt or even basic decency. There was nothing. His eyes were empty, his expression bored, and behind him, Victoria watched with barely concealed satisfaction, while Margaret nodded approvingly. "You want me to sign divorce papers while I'm in labor?" Emma's voice came out stronger than she felt, powered by rage so pure it temporarily overrode the physical agony racking her body. "While I'm giving birth to your child." Margaret stepped forward, her tone dripping with false compassion. "Emma, dear, let's not be dramatic. You're getting excellent medical care. The timing is actually quite practical. Once the baby is born, we'll handle custody arrangements appropriately. You'll receive a settlement, nothing extravagant of course, and you can return to your own people. This is the kindest solution for everyone involved." The kindest solution. Emma wanted to laugh at the audacity, but another contraction hit, stronger than before, and she had to focus every ounce of energy on breathing through it. The nurses had gone silent, frozen in place by what they were witnessing, their faces pale with shock. One of them, a young woman with kind eyes, moved closer to Emma's side as if to offer protection, and Emma caught her gaze, seeing reflected there the same outrage Emma felt but couldn't express through the pain. Have you ever experienced a moment so surreal, so cruel, that your mind couldn't fully accept it was happening? Emma was living that moment, trapped in a body in crisis, while the people who should have protected her orchestrated her final humiliation. Elliot picked up the pen and held it out to her, his impatience visible. "Emma, don't make this harder than it needs to be. Sign the papers. You know this marriage was a mistake. Everyone knows it, even if you know it. Let's end this with whatever dignity you have left." Dignity. The word hung in the air like an insult. Emma looked at the golden pen gleaming in his hand, at the divorce papers that would erase 5 years of suffering and betrayal with a few signatures, at Margaret's cold satisfaction and Victoria's victorious smile. She thought about Robert Chen's business card tucked in her purse, about the legal frameworks he'd been quietly building, about the evidence she'd been cataloging for years. She thought about the child currently fighting to enter a world that had already been poisoned by cruelty. And then, with a clarity that cut through the pain like a blade, Emma understood. This wasn't just about ending the marriage. This was about erasing her completely, reducing her to nothing, ensuring that when the story of Elliot Thompson's life was told, she would be a footnote, easily dismissed and quickly forgotten. They wanted her to disappear, and they wanted her to cooperate in her own erasure. Emma reached for the pen, her hand shaking not from weakness, but from the effort of containing fury so massive it threatened to consume her. She took the golden pen from Elliot's hand, feeling its weight, its cold metal surface. And she thought about how perfectly it symbolized everything they tried to make her believe, that wealth and power and inherited status mattered more than human decency, more than love, more than basic kindness. She picked up the first page of the divorce agreement and began to read, her eyes scanning the legal language even as another contraction built. The nurse beside her leaned close and whispered, "You don't have to do this now. You can wait. You have rights." Emma met her eyes and saw an ally, someone who understood that what was happening in this room was wrong, someone who would remember. "Thank you," Emma whispered back. "But I need to do this. I need them to think they've won." She turned back to papers and signed her name on the first line, then the second, then the third. Each signature felt like a key turning in a lock, not confining her, but releasing something that had been contained for too long. Elliot watched with satisfaction. Margaret nodded with approval. Victoria smiled openly now, no longer bothering to hide her triumph. None of them understood what Emma knew, that every signature was being witnessed by nurses who were horrified, that the timing and circumstances of this coercion would be documented in medical records, that the golden pen and the divorce papers and the presence of the mistress created a tableau so morally repugnant that it would become evidence of cruelty, so calculated it couldn't be explained away. Emma signed the final page and set down the pen with careful precision. Another contraction hit, the strongest yet, and she couldn't suppress the cry of pain that escaped. The nurses rushed to check her progress, their professionalism returning now that the legal horror show had concluded. "You're fully dilated," the head nurse announced. "It's time to push." Elliot gathered the signed papers with visible relief, tucking them back into the envelope, like someone completing a successful business transaction. "We'll leave you to it then," he said, already moving toward the door. "Someone will be in touch about custody arrangements and visitation schedules." Emma grabbed his wrist with strength that surprised them both, her grip fierce despite the exhaustion and pain. "Look at me," she said, her voice low and steady. "Look at me, Elliot, and remember this moment. Remember what you did here today. Remember that you brought your mistress to watch me give birth to your child while you forced me to sign away my marriage. Remember every detail, because one day you're going to wish you'd made different choices." Elliot pulled his wrist free, his expression flickering with something that might have been uncertainty before the arrogance returned. "Dramatic to the end," he said. "Goodbye, Emma." He walked out with Victoria on his arm and Margaret following behind, and the door closed with a soft click that felt like the end of everything Emma had endured for 5 years. But as another contraction seized her and the nurses surrounded her with encouragement and support, Emma felt something unexpected bloom in her chest. Not defeat, not despair. Something fiercer and more dangerous. Liberation. They thought they'd destroyed her. They thought the signed papers meant victory. They had no idea that Emma had just triggered a sequence of events they couldn't see coming, that every witness in this room would remember what they'd seen, that the cruelty they displayed so openly would become the foundation of their own destruction. "You're doing great," the young nurse said, holding Emma's hand. "Just a few more pushes, and you'll meet your baby." Emma pushed with everything she had left, channeling 5 years of suppressed rage and pain and endurance into the physical act of bringing life into the world. She pushed through contractions that felt like dying and rebirth happening simultaneously. She pushed until her body was spent and her voice was raw from screaming, and everything hurt so badly she couldn't separate one source of pain from another. And then suddenly there was crying. Not her crying. A baby crying. Her baby. The nurse laid the infant on Emma's chest, a tiny girl with Emma's dark hair and a face scrunched up in indignant protest at being born into cold air and bright lights. Emma looked down at her daughter and felt love so overwhelming it physically hurt, a different kind of pain, the kind that heals even as it wounds. "She's perfect," Emma whispered, touching the baby's impossibly small fingers. "You're perfect, and I promise you'll never feel what I felt. I promise you'll grow up knowing your worth isn't determined by other people's cruelty. I promise you'll be protected." The baby's crying softened as if she understood, her tiny hand wrapping around Emma's finger with surprising strength. The head nurse smiled, her eyes wet. "What's her name?" Emma hadn't planned a name, hadn't let herself think that far ahead through all the months of pregnancy and escalating cruelty. But looking at her daughter now, feeling the weight of responsibility and love and fierce protection, a name came to her. "Grace," she said. "Her name is Grace. Because that's what they never gave me, and it's what I'll give her every day of her life." What would you do if you just survived the worst moment of your life and somehow found the strength to see it as a beginning instead of an ending? Emma lay in that hospital bed, holding her daughter, surrounded by nurses who'd witnessed her humiliation and would never forget it. And she understood something fundamental. The signed divorce papers weren't her defeat. They were Elliot's confession, documented proof of cruelty, so extreme it couldn't be rationalized or defended. And while he was probably celebrating right now, drinking expensive champagne with Victoria and accepting Margaret's congratulations, Emma was holding evidence they'd handed her freely. A baby born on the same day her mother was forced to sign divorce papers in active labor. Medical records that would show the exact timing. Witnesses who'd watched in horror. And a golden pen that symbolized everything about their arrogance and assumption of immunity. Emma looked down at Grace, who'd fallen asleep against her chest, and smiled. The war wasn't over. In fact, it was just beginning. And this time, Emma wasn't fighting alone. She had her daughter. She had allies they didn't know about. She had evidence they'd created themselves. And most importantly, she had nothing left to lose, which made her more dangerous than they could possibly imagine. Emma spent 3 days in the hospital after Grace was born. 3 days of unexpected peace, where the only sounds were her daughter's soft breathing and the gentle encouragement of nurses who'd witnessed her humiliation and responded with fierce, protective kindness. No one from the Thompson family visited. No flowers arrived. No calls came asking about the baby's health or Emma's recovery. The silence was absolute, and for the first time in 5 years, Emma found it liberating rather than isolating. She held Grace against her chest, counted tiny fingers and toes, and felt something shift fundamentally inside her. The woman who'd arrived at that estate with hope and humility was gone, replaced by someone harder, smarter, and infinitely more dangerous. On the morning of her discharge, Robertson appeared in her doorway with a manila folder that looked ordinary but felt weighted with significance. "How are you feeling?" he asked, settling into the chair beside her bed. Emma adjusted Grace in her arms, the baby sleeping peacefully despite the storm gathering around her. "Stronger than they think," Emma replied. "Good," Robert said, opening the folder. "Because what I'm about to tell you is going to sound impossible, but I need you to trust me. Your mother, before she passed, she knew something about your father's work that she never told you. Your father didn't just build homes, Emma. He built the original Thompson estate, the foundation that everything they value was constructed upon. And when he died, your mother inherited rights to certain aspects of that property, legal protections built into the original contracts that the Thompsons either forgot about or never bothered to read carefully." Emma's heart began to race. "What are you saying?" Robert smiled, and it wasn't a kind smile. It was the smile of someone who'd been waiting years to deliver justice. "I'm saying your mother left you something far more valuable than they could imagine. A trust, established through property rights and contractual obligations, worth approximately $75 million. The number hung in the air like something physical, too large to comprehend all at once. Emma stared at Robert, waiting for him to laugh, to say it was a mistake, to explain that she'd misheard. But he simply pulled documents from a folder, spreading them across the hospital bed, each one bearing official seals and legal language that confirmed what seemed impossible. "My mother never told me," Emma whispered. Robert nodded. "She wanted to protect you. She knew that if the Thompsons discovered this before you were ready, they'd find ways to challenge it, to tie it up in courts for years. So she waited, structured everything to activate only under specific conditions. And 3 days ago, when Elliot forced you to sign those divorce papers while you were in labor, he triggered every single protection clause she'd built into the trust." Emma looked down at Grace, then back at the documents, her mind struggling to process the magnitude of what Robert was revealing. "They have no idea," she said slowly. Robert's smile widened. "None whatsoever. They think they've discarded you. They think you'll take whatever settlement they offer and disappear. They have no concept that the woman they spent 5 years destroying actually controls the financial foundation their entire legacy rests upon. Have you ever discovered that the people who treated you as worthless were actually standing on ground you owned?" That's what Emma was learning, and the irony was so perfect it almost made her laugh. Almost. Because there was nothing funny about 5 years of systematic cruelty, nothing amusing about being forced to sign divorce papers while giving birth. But there was something deeply, profoundly satisfying about understanding that every act of humiliation had been building toward this moment, this revelation, this quiet transfer of power that no one saw coming. "What happens now?" Emma asked, her voice steady despite the emotions churning inside her. Robert gathered the documents carefully. "Now we wait. We let them think they've won. We let Elliot celebrate his freedom with Victoria. We let Margaret congratulate herself on finally removing the stain from her family. And while they're busy celebrating, we put everything in place. Legal protections for you and Grace. Financial restructuring that they won't notice until it's too late. Strategic moves that will ensure when the truth finally emerges, there's nothing they can do to stop it." Emma spent the next 2 weeks in a small apartment Robert had arranged far from the Thompson estate, where she learned to navigate motherhood while Robert's legal team worked behind the scenes. Grace was an easy baby, sleeping in long stretches and waking only to eat, as if she understood that her mother needed time to think, to plan, to transform grief and rage into strategy. Emma would sit in the rocking chair by the window, nursing Grace while reviewing documents Robert brought her, learning the full extent of what her mother had built. Property rights, contractual obligations, moral clauses embedded in the original construction agreements stipulated that if the Thompson family ever acted in ways that violated basic human dignity, certain financial protections would activate. Her mother had been a teacher, yes, but she'd also been brilliant, strategic, and far more aware of the Thompson family's nature than Emma had ever realized. She knew, Emma whispered to Grace one night. She knew they'd try to destroy me, and she left me weapons they couldn't see. The first indication that something was shifting came 3 weeks after Grace's birth. Robert called Emma with news delivered in a voice tight with satisfaction. "Victoria's getting nervous," he said. "She's been asking questions about the divorce settlement, about when you'll be moving out officially, about whether you've hired lawyers. She's pushing Elliot to finalize everything quickly." Emma smiled, adjusting Grace on her shoulder. "Why would she be nervous? They think they've already won." Robert chuckled. "Because Victoria's smarter than Elliot gives her credit for. She's been documenting his behavior, Emma. Not out of loyalty to you, but as insurance for herself. She's realized that a man who would force his wife to sign divorce papers during labor isn't someone who can be trusted. So she's been collecting evidence, recording conversations, taking photos. She's building her own case, and in doing so, she's inadvertently building ours." The revelation was unexpected and perfect. Emma had assumed Victoria was simply cruel, another weapon Margaret had deployed. But the truth was more complex. Victoria was a survivor too, just playing a different game with different stakes. What would you do if you discovered that your enemy's ally was secretly working against them? That the woman who'd replaced you was documenting the very cruelty that had defined your suffering? Emma felt the pieces falling into place with satisfying precision. "Can we use her?" she asked Robert. "We already are," he replied. I've had someone reach out through intermediary channels. Victoria's receptive to the idea of cooperation, especially once she understands that the Thompson fortune isn't as secure as Elliot believes. She's practical Emma. She wants protection and financial security, and she's willing to provide testimony and evidence in exchange for guarantees that we can offer. Emma looked down at Grace, who'd fallen asleep with her tiny hand curled against Emma's chest. "Make the deal," she said. "But make sure she understands that her cooperation doesn't erase what she did. She participated in my humiliation. She'll help us bring them down, but that doesn't make us friends." Within days, Victoria's documentation began flowing through Robert's office. Videos of Elliot discussing Emma with contempt, calling her worthless, laughing about the divorce papers signed in the labor room. Recordings of Margaret planning the hospital confrontation, discussing how to maximize Emma's humiliation while minimizing legal exposure. Photos of family gatherings where Emma had been systematically excluded and mocked. Each piece of evidence was damning on its own, but together they painted a picture of cruelty so calculated and pervasive that no court, no public tribunal, no social circle could dismiss it as misunderstanding or exaggeration. Emma reviewed the evidence with clinical detachment, her emotions carefully contained. She'd cried enough over the past 5 years. Now was the time for precision, for strategy, for ensuring that justice arrived with such quiet inevitability that escape was impossible. The second shift came when Emma's trust officially activated. Robert had structured the timing perfectly, waiting until the divorce papers Elliot had filed were officially processed before triggering the financial mechanisms Emma's mother had established. On a Tuesday morning, exactly 6 weeks after Grace's birth, the Thompson family's primary bank received notification that certain property rights were being transferred, that contractual obligations established 30 years earlier were now being enforced, and that the financial foundation of the Thompson estate was subject to immediate restructuring. Elliot received the notification first, and according to Victoria's subsequent report, he'd gone pale, his hands shaking as he read the legal language he couldn't fully comprehend. He'd called his lawyers immediately, demanding explanations, insisting there must be mistakes. But there were no mistakes. Everything was documented, legally sound, and utterly unassailable. Margaret's reaction was more contained, but no less panicked. She'd spent decades building the Thompson reputation, using wealth and influence as tools of power and control, and suddenly she was being informed that much of that wealth wasn't actually theirs to control. The property her family had built their legacy upon was subject to claims she'd never anticipated. The financial instruments she'd used to maintain social position were being restructured in ways that diminished her authority. And the name she'd protected so fiercely was about to be associated with cruelty, so extreme it would become a cautionary tale in the very social circles she'd dominated. Victoria reported that Margaret had locked herself in her study for hours, emerging only to make frantic phone calls to lawyers and accountants who kept delivering the same impossible message. There was nothing they could do. The legal framework was ironclad. Emma's mother had been a teacher, but she'd also been the daughter of a construction worker who'd learned to read contracts with paranoid precision, and she'd used that knowledge to create protections her daughter would need decades later. Have you ever watched someone realize they've been outmaneuvered by the person they most underestimated? That's what was happening to the Thompson family, and Emma wasn't even there to witness it. She was in her small apartment, rocking Grace to sleep, reviewing financial reports that showed her net worth increasing while theirs decreased, and feeling something she'd never felt before, the quiet, assured satisfaction of justice achieved through intelligence rather than force. "Your grandmother was remarkable," Emma whispered to Grace. "She saw what I couldn't see. She knew what I'd need. And she left me everything required to protect us both." Grace stirred slightly, her tiny features peaceful in sleep, and Emma felt her resolve solidify into something unbreakable. The Thompson family had spent 5 years trying to erase her, to make her feel worthless, to convince her that humility and origin define value. They'd succeeded only in creating someone who understood exactly how cruelty worked, exactly how power operated, and exactly how to dismantle both with the same patience they tried to weaponize against her. The final piece of the puzzle fell into place when the philanthropic investments Emma's mother had structured began redirecting funds. Charities the Thompson family had used for tax advantages and social positioning suddenly found their donations being scrutinized, their sources questioned, their moral foundations examined. Organizations that had once grateful accepted Thompson money now faced public pressure to refuse it, to distance themselves from a family whose cruelty had been documented in medical records, witnessed by hospital staff, and corroborated by the very mistress they'd used as a weapon. Elliot's reputation, carefully cultivated over decades, began to crumble. Business partners started asking uncomfortable questions. Social invitations dried up. The very circles that had once welcomed him with automatic deference now viewed him with suspicion and judgment. And through it all, Emma remained invisible, a ghost they tried to create who'd become far more powerful than any living presence could be. Robert visited Emma on a gray afternoon when Grace was 2 months old, bringing news that felt like the final confirmation of everything they'd built. "It's done," he said simply. "The trust is fully activated. Your financial security and Grace's future are guaranteed." The Thompson family's attempts to challenge the legal framework have all failed. They're trapped in a situation of their own making, and there's nothing they can do except watch as everything they thought they controlled slips away. Emma nodded slowly, feeling not triumph, but a deep, bone-tired relief. "And Victoria?" Robert smiled. "She secured her own settlement and disappeared. Smart woman. She saw which way the wind was blowing and made sure she'd land safely." Emma looked down at Grace, who was awake and staring at her with the unfocused intensity of infants learning to see the world. "Then it's really over," she said quietly. "No," Robert corrected gently. "It's really beginning. You have resources now. You have power. You have proof that intelligence and patience can overcome cruelty and arrogance. What you do with all of that, that's the story that starts now." 3 months after Grace's birth, Emma's world had transformed in ways invisible to everyone except those who knew where to look. She moved through her days with a clarity that came from understanding exactly where she stood, not as a victim anymore, but as someone who controlled outcomes without needing to announce it. Her apartment was modest but comfortable, filled with Grace's soft sounds and the documents that charted the slow, methodical dismantling of everything the Thompson family had built their identity upon. Emma would sit by the window in the early mornings, Grace sleeping in her bassinet nearby, and read reports that detailed Elliot's crumbling empire with the same clinical detachment a doctor might use reviewing test results. The numbers told stories of desperation. Business deals falling through, social invitations withdrawn, former allies suddenly unavailable for meetings. Each development was a domino falling in a sequence Emma hadn't even needed to push. Gravity alone doing the work once the foundation shifted. Robert visited weekly with updates that felt like chapters in a novel Emma was reading rather than living. "Elliot's trying to borrow against properties he thinks he still controls," Robert said one afternoon, settling into the chair across from Emma while she nursed Grace. "His lawyers keep explaining that the property rights were transferred, but he doesn't seem to understand how completely. He's operating on assumptions that stopped being true the day you signed those divorce papers." Emma smiled, the expression more satisfaction than joy. "And Margaret?" Robert's eyes gleamed with something close to admiration. "She's making calls to everyone she knows, trying to understand what happened. The problem is that the people who could explain it are the same people who are quietly distancing themselves from the family. No one wants to be associated with the kind of cruelty that's been documented. The hospital staff who witnessed the labor room confrontation have been talking, Emma. Not publicly, not officially, but in the way these things spread through social circles. Whispers. Rumors. The kind of reputation damage that money can't fix because it's built on truth. Have you ever watched someone who thought they were untouchable discover that reputation is built on sand? That's what was happening to the Thompson family, and Emma wasn't even in the room to witness it. She was feeding her daughter, reviewing financial statements, and building a life that didn't require their validation or acceptance. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd spent 5 years trying to belong, and now that she'd stopped trying, she possessed more power than they'd ever allowed her to access. "There's something else," Robert said, his tone shifting to something more careful. "Victoria's been reaching out through back channels. She wants to meet with you." Emma looked up sharply. "Why?" Robert pulled out his phone, showing Emma a series of messages. "She says she has information about Margaret's financial planning, strategies they were developing to try to challenge your trust. She's offering it freely, no conditions, just wants you to know what they were attempting." Emma read the messages carefully, each one revealing Victoria's growing desperation to be seen as an ally rather than an enemy. The woman who'd smiled while Emma suffered was now scrambling for protection, understanding too late that she'd allied herself with people whose cruelty extended to anyone they perceived as useful rather than valuable. "Set up the meeting," Emma said finally, "but somewhere public. I want witnesses to whatever she says." Robert nodded, already typing. "You're learning fast." Emma adjusted Grace, who'd finished nursing, and was now looking around with the unfocused curiosity of infants discovering the world. "I had good teachers. They just didn't realize they were teaching me how to survive them instead of accepting them." The meeting happened in a quiet cafe 3 days later, Victoria arriving early and looking nothing like the polished woman who'd attended Thompson family dinners. Her clothes were still expensive, but less carefully chosen, her makeup lighter, her entire presence suggesting someone who'd stopped performing and started surviving. Emma arrived with Grace in a carrier, the baby serving as both shield and reminder of what Victoria had witnessed without intervening. They sat across from each other, two women who'd been used as weapons in someone else's war, now trying to navigate an uneasy peace. "Thank you for meeting me," Victoria said, her voice lacking the confident edge Emma remembered. "I know you have no reason to trust me." Emma settled Grace's carrier on the chair beside her, keeping one hand protectively on the edge. "You're right. I don't. So tell me why you're here." Victoria pulled out a folder, sliding it across the table. "Because I've spent 3 months watching Elliot panic, and I've realized something important. The man I thought I was securing a future with is actually a child who's never faced consequences. When the money started shifting, when the social invitations stopped coming, he didn't become strategic. He became vicious. And that viciousness is now directed at me." Emma opened the folder, scanning documents that detailed Margaret's attempts to challenge the trust through obscure legal loopholes, financial maneuvers designed to hide assets, and communications with lawyers who'd advised that their best strategy was to destroy Emma's credibility publicly if they couldn't challenge the trust legally. Each page was worse than the last, revealing a family so desperate to maintain control that they were willing to commit acts that bordered on criminal. "Why are you giving me this?" Emma asked, looking up at Victoria. "Because I was stupid enough to think they valued loyalty," Victoria said quietly. "I documented everything thinking it would give me leverage, insurance against being discarded. But what I've learned is that people who would force a woman to sign divorce papers during labor don't understand loyalty. They understand utility. And the moment I stopped being useful, I became a liability." She leaned forward, her expression intense. "Emma, they're planning to come after you publicly. Margaret's hiring investigators to dig into your past, looking for anything that could discredit you. Elliot's talking to journalists about writing a version of events where you're the villain, the gold digger who manipulated her way into their family and then stole their fortune through legal trickery. What would you do if you discovered your enemies were so desperate they were willing to destroy themselves trying to destroy you?" Emma felt rage rise in her chest, hot and immediate, but she forced it down, channeling it into the cold calculation that had kept her alive for 5 years. "Let them," she said finally. "Let them investigate. Let them talk to journalists. Let them tell their version of events. Because every lie they tell will be contradicted by documented evidence. Hospital records, witness testimony, financial documents that prove my mother established that trust decades ago, long before I ever met Elliot. They can't rewrite history when the truth is documented in legal filings and medical records. Victoria nodded slowly. That's what I thought you'd say. That's why I'm giving you this. Because whatever fight is coming, you deserve to know exactly what you're facing. Emma gathered the documents carefully, sliding them back into the folder. Victoria, I need you to understand something. This doesn't make us friends. This doesn't erase what you did, sitting at their table while they humiliated me, smiling while they planned my destruction. You were part of that cruelty, even if you're regretting it now. Victoria's eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away. I know. I don't expect forgiveness. I just want to make sure that when this is over, someone remembers that not everyone in that house was blind to what was happening. Some of us just lacked the courage to stop it. Emma stood, lifting Grace's carrier with practiced ease. Courage isn't about stopping cruelty when it's convenient, Victoria. It's about refusing to participate in it even when participation benefits you. You failed that test. But your information is valuable and I'll use it. That's as close to redemption as you're going to get from me. She left the cafe feeling the weight of what was coming. The final confrontation that had been building since the moment she'd signed those papers in the hospital. The Thompson family was going to attack publicly and viciously, and Emma would need to be ready with evidence so overwhelming that their lies would collapse under scrutiny. That evening, she called Robert with new urgency. They're going to go public, she told him. Margaret's hiring investigators. Elliot's talking to journalists. They're going to try to destroy my reputation because they can't challenge the trust legally. Robert was quiet for a moment, the sound of pages turning audible through the phone. Then we moved to the next phase. Emma, your mother didn't just leave you money. She left you a complete strategy for exactly this scenario. There are journalists she identified years ago, people with integrity, who'd be interested in a story about systematic family cruelty and financial manipulation. There are legal experts who've been waiting for permission to speak about what they witnessed. Your mother knew this family better than they knew themselves, and she planned for every possible attack. Have you ever realized that the person who loved you most saw dangers you couldn't imagine and left you weapons to fight battles you hadn't yet faced? That's what Emma understood in that moment. Her mother's love extending beyond death to protect a daughter who'd needed protection in ways neither of them could have fully predicted. Then we use everything, Emma said, her voice steady with resolve. Every witness, every document, every piece of evidence Victoria just provided. We tell the complete story, from the first day I arrived at that estate to the moment they forced me to sign papers while I was giving birth. We show the world exactly who the Thompson family is, and we let them try to defend themselves against documented truth. Robert's smile was audible. Now you're thinking like someone who's going to win. I'll start making calls. When they come at you publicly, we'll be ready with a response that doesn't just offend you. It destroys them. Emma hung up and looked at Grace, who was awake and watching her with the serious expression babies sometimes wore, as if they understood more than adults gave them credit for. Your grandmother was remarkable, Emma whispered. She saw all of this coming, every attack, every betrayal, every moment when I'd need strength I didn't know I had. And she left me everything I'd need to protect us both. That's what love looks like, Grace. Not the performance your father's family staged, but the quiet preparation that happens when someone truly sees you and wants you to survive. Grace reached up, her tiny hand grasping at air, and Emma caught it gently. The war was escalating, the final battle approaching, and Emma stood at the center of it, with weapons her enemies couldn't see, and allies they'd created through their own cruelty. She was ready. She'd been ready for years, training without knowing it, enduring without understanding that endurance was building exactly what she'd need for this moment. And now, finally, the world would see what patience and intelligence could accomplish when directed by someone who'd survived everything designed to break her. The article appeared on a Tuesday morning in a publication known for investigative journalism that exposed the corruption of the wealthy and powerful. Emma hadn't written it, hadn't even spoken to the journalist directly, but her mother had identified him years ago as someone who'd care about a story like this. The headline was simple and devastating. The Thompson family. When wealth becomes weapon. Below it, photographs showed the estate Emma had once called home, the hospital where Grace was born, and medical records with key passages highlighted. The journalist had done his work thoroughly, interviewing the nurses who'd witnessed the labor room confrontation, reviewing financial documents that proved Emma's mother had established the trust decades before Emma ever met Elliot, and cataloging 5 years of systematic cruelty with the precision of someone building a legal case rather than writing a story. By noon, the article had been shared 40,000 times. By evening, it was national news. Elliot's phone started ringing before he'd finished reading the first paragraph. Business partners who'd been quietly distancing themselves now wanted immediate meetings to discuss whether their associations with him posed reputation risks to their own companies. Social clubs, where membership had been automatic for Thompson men, suddenly had board meetings scheduled to review conduct policies. The invitations that had been slowing to a trickle stopped completely, replaced by carefully worded emails explaining that perhaps this year's gala or that charity dinner might not be the right venue given the current circumstances. Have you ever watched someone's entire social foundation crumble in a single day? Elliot experienced it in real time. Each notification on his phone, another brick falling from the wall of privilege he'd assumed was permanent. He called his lawyers in a panic, demanding they sue for defamation, but they explained what he should have understood immediately. Truth is an absolute defense, and everything in the article was documented, witnessed, and legally unassailable. Margaret's response was more calculated, but equally desperate. She locked herself in her study with her own team of lawyers and crisis management experts, people who specialized in rehabilitating damaged reputations and burying scandals under layers of strategic philanthropy and public relations campaigns. But the problem was fundamental. How do you rehabilitate a reputation built on documented cruelty? The medical records were public now, signed statements from nurses describing what they'd witnessed in that hospital room. The recordings Victoria had provided were leaked selectively, enough to prove they existed without releasing everything, making it clear that more evidence was available if needed. Margaret emerged from her study after 6 hours looking older than Emma had ever seen her, the polish and confidence replaced by something closer to panic. "This is your doing," she hissed at Elliot, as if he alone had orchestrated their downfall rather than participated in a pattern of abuse that had made it inevitable. "You brought that woman into our family, and now she's destroyed everything." Elliot's response revealed how completely he'd failed to understand what was happening. "She was nobody," he said, his voice rising with frustration. "A teacher's daughter married a construction worker. How does someone like that have this kind of power?" The question hung in the air, exposing the fundamental flaw in their thinking. They'd measured Emma by her origins rather than her intelligence, by her humility rather than her capacity for strategic patience, and that miscalculation had cost them everything. Margaret turned away from him, her silence more damning than any accusation. She'd built her life on the belief that breeding and wealth determined worth, that people like Emma could be controlled and dismissed because they lacked the social capital to fight back. The article had proven that belief catastrophically wrong, and Margaret was facing the collapse of not just her family's fortune, but her entire worldview. The social consequences arrived with brutal speed. Caroline, Elliot's sister, who'd once offered Emma fashion advice with condescending pity, called in tears after her own husband suggested they might need to distance themselves from the Thompson name for the sake of their children's futures. Family friends who'd attended countless dinners where Emma had been humiliated now sent formal letters expressing shock at what they'd learned, reframing their silence as ignorance rather than complicity. The transformation was sudden and total. The family that had once been the center of their social world now found themselves on the outside looking in, experiencing the isolation they'd inflicted on Emma multiplied by their former status. What does it feel like to be excluded from everything you once controlled? To walk into rooms that fall silent not with respect, but with judgment? The Thompsons were learning, and the education was merciless. Within a week, anonymous letters began arriving at the estate, some sympathetic, but most cutting and cruel, People who'd apparently harbored resentments for years, now feeling safe to express them. "We always knew you were awful," one read. "We just smiled because your money made it necessary." Another was more direct. "What you did to that woman in the hospital was evil, and everyone sees it now." Margaret burned the letters in her fireplace, but the words had already done their damage, confirming what she most feared. Their power had been built on fear and obligation rather than genuine respect, and once that power dissolved, there was nothing beneath it but the contempt they'd always inspired but never recognized. Elliot stopped going to his office after reporters started showing up, asking him to comment on the article, to explain the divorce papers signed during labor, to justify bringing his mistress to watch his wife give birth. He had no answers that didn't make him sound worse, no explanations that could transform documented cruelty into understandable choices. Robert visited Emma 2 weeks after the article was published, bringing news that felt like the final chapter of something that had started 5 years ago, when she'd first walked through those iron gates. "They're trying to sell this state," he said, settling into his usual chair while Emma rocked Grace to sleep. Quietly, through private channels, trying to liquidate assets before the restructuring is complete. But the property rights your mother secured make that complicated. Every potential buyer discovers the legal entanglements and backs away. The house that was supposed to be their legacy has become an anchor dragging them down. Emma looked at Grace, her daughter's face peaceful in sleep, entirely unaware of the war being fought around her. "My mother thought of everything," she said quietly. "She really did," Robert agreed. "The moral clauses she embedded in those contracts are being triggered one by one. Every act of cruelty, every documented instance of abuse, activates another protection. It's like she built a legal time bomb that only exploded when they proved they deserve it." Emma thought about her mother, the elementary school teacher who'd loved literature and taught children to read, who'd apparently spent her evenings reading contract law and building safeguards for a daughter who'd need them in ways neither of them could have predicted. "I wish you could see this," Emma said, her voice thick with emotion she rarely allowed herself to feel. "I think she can," Robert replied gently. "And I think she'd be proud not because the Thompsons are suffering, but because you survived them with your humanity intact. That's the real victory here, Emma. Not that they fell, but that you didn't become like them in the process of protecting yourself." The words landed with unexpected weight, and Emma felt tears she'd been holding back for months finally break free. She'd been so focused on strategy and survival that she hadn't stopped to acknowledge what it had cost her. The years of pain and isolation and systematic destruction of her self-worth. But she'd survived. She'd protected her daughter. She'd proved that intelligence and patience could overcome cruelty and arrogance. And most importantly, she'd done it without becoming cruel herself, without letting their poison turn her into something she'd hate to see in the mirror. 3 days later, Emma received a call from an unknown number. She almost didn't answer, but something made her pick up. "Emma." The voice was Elliot's, stripped of the confidence and contempt she remembered, reduced to something small and desperate. "Don't hang up, please." Emma said nothing, waiting. "I need to talk to you," Elliot continued. "Not about money or legal things. About Grace. About being her father. I know I have no right to ask for anything, but she's my daughter too, and I don't want her growing up thinking I didn't care." Emma felt rage rise in her throat, hot and immediate. "You didn't care," she said, her voice cold. "You forced me to sign divorce papers while I was giving birth to her. You brought your mistress to watch me suffer. You spent 5 years making me feel worthless. And now you want me to believe you care about Grace." There was silence on the other end, and Emma heard something that might have been crying. "I know," Elliot said finally. "I know what I did. I know there's no excuse. But I'm begging you, don't punish her, because I'm a terrible person. Let me try to be better. For her." Emma looked at Grace, sleeping peacefully in her bassinet, and made a decision that surprised even her. "You'll have supervised visitation," she said, "through legal channels, with therapists present. And if you ever try to make her feel the way your family made me feel, I will use every resource I have to ensure you never see her again. Do you understand?" Elliot's voice was barely a whisper. "Yes. Thank you. Emma, I'm sorry. I know it doesn't matter now, but I'm sorry. Emma hung up without responding, her hand shaking. She'd won the war, destroyed their empire, proved that cruelty had consequences. But she wouldn't let their poison infect Grace's future. Her daughter would know her father, would make her own judgments, would grow up understanding that people were complex, and forgiveness was possible even when it wasn't deserved. That was the kind of power Emma chose to wield. Not revenge that mirrored their cruelty, but justice that left room for redemption she wasn't required to grant, but could offer anyway. 6 months after the article's publication, Emma stood in the office that had once belonged to her mother, surrounded by filing cabinets containing decades of careful planning. Robert had arranged for Emma to access her mother's original documents, and what she discovered there took her breath away. Her mother hadn't just protected her financially. She'd built an entire framework for how Emma should use that protection. Detailed instructions for redirecting the Thompson family's philanthropic investments toward causes that actually serve people rather than tax advantages and social positioning. Each charity the Thompsons had used as a prop was listed with alternative organizations that did real work, along with legal mechanisms to transfer funding without their consent. She wanted you to do more than survive, Robert said, standing beside Emma as she read through page after page of her mother's handwriting. She wanted you to transform their legacy of cruelty into something that actually helped people. Emma picked up a letter her mother had written but never sent, addressed to her and dated 5 years ago, just months before she passed away. My dearest Emma, it read, if you're reading this, it means you've survived what I knew was coming. The Thompson family measures worth by money and breeding. But real worth is measured by how you treat people who can't benefit you. You married into cruelty, and I couldn't stop you because you loved him, and hope is a powerful thing. But I could prepare you for the moment when hope died and strategy became necessary. Use what I've left you not for revenge, but for justice. Show them that the woman they thought worthless was actually priceless, and that intelligence paired with patience can accomplish what force never could. I love you. I'm proud of you. And I'm sorry I won't be there to see you win. Emma's hands trembled as she set the letter down, tears streaming down her face. Her mother had seen everything, understood everything, and loved her enough to spend years building weapons Emma would need against enemies she hadn't yet met. The first major redirection happened within weeks. The Thompson Children's Hospital, which had borne their name for 30 years based on donations Margaret had structured primarily for tax benefits and naming rights, received notification that funding was being transferred to a network of community clinics in underserved neighborhoods. The transfer was legal and irreversible, triggered by the moral clauses Emma's mother had embedded in the original donation agreements. Margaret called Emma directly for the first time since the hospital confrontation, her voice shaking with rage. You're destroying our legacy, she hissed. That hospital bears our name. It represents decades of our family's commitment to children's health. Emma's response was calm, almost gentle. Your family's commitment was to having your name on a building, Margaret. The actual care of children was secondary. The clinics receiving the funding will treat 10 times as many children without requiring naming rights or photo opportunities. That's legacy. What you built was vanity. Margaret's silence was long and heavy. When she finally spoke, her voice had lost its sharpness, replaced by something closer to defeat. You've won, Emma. You've taken everything we built and twisted it into something unrecognizable. Are you satisfied? Emma thought about that question carefully before answering. Satisfaction isn't what I feel. What I feel is purpose. Your family spent 5 years trying to make me feel worthless, and in doing so, you showed me exactly what real worth looks like. It's not about having your name on buildings or being invited to the right parties. It's about using whatever power you have to make life better for people who have less power than you. That's what my mother understood and what your family never will. She paused, then added quietly, I don't need your defeat to feel victorious, Margaret. I need to know that Grace will grow up in a world where kindness matters more than pedigree. That's what I'm building with the resources you thought made you superior to me. Have you ever taken something meant to hurt you and transformed it into something that heals others? That's what Emma was doing, piece by piece, donation by donation, redirecting decades of the Thompson family's self-serving philanthropy toward actual change. The Thompson Arts Foundation, which had primarily funded galas where wealthy people congratulated themselves for appreciating culture, saw its resources shifted toward scholarships for talented students from low-income backgrounds. The Thompson Legal Fund, used mainly to protect the family's business interests, became a source of free legal aid for women escaping abusive marriages. Each transformation was documented and publicized, not as revenge, but as correction, showing what those millions could accomplish when directed by someone who understood need rather than ego. And with each change, Emma's reputation grew, while the Thompson name became associated with the very kind of reform their family had always resisted. Robert brought news of unexpected allies emerging from places Emma hadn't anticipated. The hospital nurses who witnessed the labor room confrontation have formed an advocacy group, he said one afternoon while Emma reviewed grant applications. They're working to change hospital policies around patient rights during childbirth, using your case as an example of what should never be allowed to happen again. They're calling it Grace's Law, named after your daughter. Emma felt emotion catch in her throat. What she'd experienced as the worst moment of her life was becoming a catalyst for protecting other women from similar cruelty. How many hospitals are adopting it? She asked. Robert smiled. 43 so far, with more reviewing the policies. Your story is changing healthcare practices across the country, Emma. The cruelty you endured is preventing cruelty against others. That's a legacy. The financial restructuring continued with surgical precision. Properties the Thompson family had acquired through questionable means were returned to communities they displaced. Business investments that had profited from exploitation were sold, and the proceeds directed toward worker-owned cooperatives. Each action was legal, documented, and structured through the mechanisms Emma's mother had established. But the cumulative effect was the complete transformation of what the Thompson fortune represented. Margaret's friends, the ones who'd once attended her parties and praised her taste and breeding, now whispered about her family's fall from grace with the same cruelty Margaret had once directed at others. The lesson was stark. Social power built on cruelty evaporates the moment that cruelty is exposed, leaving nothing but the contempt it always inspired but temporarily suppressed. 8 months after Grace's birth, Emma moved into a new home, modest by Thompson standards, but comfortable and filled with light. Grace's nursery had windows overlooking a garden Emma tended herself. Growing vegetables she'd donate to local food banks. She declined to move into the Thompson estate despite having legal right to it, choosing instead to let it sit empty, a monument to wealth that served no purpose beyond self-celebration. Some nights, Emma would rock Grace to sleep and think about the woman she'd been when she first walked through those iron gates, hopeful and humble, and believing that love could overcome differences. That woman was gone, replaced by someone harder, but also more purposeful. Someone who understood that hope needed to be backed by strategy and love needed to be protected by boundaries. She didn't regret the transformation. The pain had been terrible, but it had also been clarifying, burning away everything false until only truth remained. One evening, Emma received an unexpected visitor. Caroline, Elliot's sister, who'd once mocked her clothes and offered condescending fashion advice, stood at Emma's door looking uncertain and smaller than Emma remembered. "I know I have no right to be here," Caroline said when Emma opened the door. "But I wanted to apologize. Not because it changes anything or because I expect forgiveness, but because you deserve to hear someone from that family acknowledge that what we did to you is wrong." Emma studied Caroline's face, looking for signs of manipulation or hidden agenda, but saw only genuine shame. "Come in," she said finally, stepping aside. They sat in Emma's living room, Grace asleep upstairs, and Caroline spoke with a candor Emma had never heard from any Thompson family member. "I watched my mother and brother destroy you for 5 years, Caroline said quietly. "And I did nothing. Worse than nothing. I participated. I made jokes about your background. I questioned your worth. And I told myself it was okay because everyone else was doing it too." Emma listened without interrupting, letting Caroline finish. When the article came out and everyone saw what really happened in that hospital, I had to face something horrible about myself. I'm not a good person. I'm not even a neutral person. I was actively cruel to someone who'd done nothing to deserve it except marry into my family. And I did because it was easier than standing up to my mother or defending what was right. She looked directly at Emma, tears streaming down her face. I'm so sorry. I know it doesn't fix anything. I know it doesn't erase the damage. But I needed you to hear it from me, not because it helps you, but because maybe it starts helping me become someone who wouldn't make the same choices again. Emma felt something unexpected soften in her chest. This wasn't the complete vindication she might have imagined, but it was something more valuable. Genuine recognition of harm done and a commitment to change. Thank you for saying that, Emma said quietly. It doesn't erase what happened, but it acknowledges it. That matters more than you might think. What would you do if someone who'd hurt you deeply came to genuinely apologize, not seeking forgiveness, but offering accountability? Emma chose Grace, the same Grace she'd named her daughter after, the Grace her mother-in-law had never offered and Emma had learned to cultivate in its absence. Caroline, the hardest thing about those 5 years wasn't the cruelty itself. It was feeling invisible while it happened, like my pain didn't register as real to anyone around me. You see it now, acknowledging it, that validates something I needed validated. So thank you. And I hope you do become the person you want to be. Not for me, but for the next person who might need someone to stand up when standing up is uncomfortable. Caroline nodded, wiping her eyes. Can I ask about Grace? About how she's doing? Emma smiled. The first genuine warmth she'd felt toward any Thompson family member. She's perfect. She's healthy and happy and surrounded by love. And when she's old enough to understand, I'll tell her the truth about everything. Not to poison her against your family, but so she learns that kindness matters more than pedigree and that cruelty always has consequences, even if justice takes time. After Caroline left, Emma sat in the quiet of her home and felt the weight of everything that had happened settle into something approaching peace. She'd survived the worst they could do to her. She'd protected her daughter. She'd transformed their legacy of cruelty into resources that actually help people. And she'd done it all without becoming cruel herself, without letting their poison corrupt her into something she'd hate. That was the victory her mother had planned for, the triumph that mattered more than money or social position or revenge. Emma had won not by destroying her enemies, but by refusing to let their destruction of her succeed. She'd built something new from the ruins of what they tried to make of her life, and that something was infinitely more valuable than anything the Thompson family had ever possessed. She'd built a purpose. She'd built a legacy. She'd built hope for her daughter that was backed by resources and protected by the very mechanisms her enemies had triggered through their own cruelty. And most importantly, she'd built a life where worth was measured by character rather than circumstance, where power served purpose rather than ego, and where the woman once dismissed as worthless proved priceless in every way that actually mattered. Elliot Thompson sat in his office at 2 a.m., surrounded by documents he could no longer control. The wall of achievements behind him, awards, photographs with politicians, framed articles praising his business acumen, now felt like evidence of a life built on illusions. His phone buzzed with another message from his attorney. We need to talk. The foundation transfers are irreversible. She had legal authority we didn't know existed. He threw the phone across the room, watching it shatter against the mahogany paneling his grandfather had installed. How does a man process the moment he realizes the person he destroyed was actually indestructible? Elliot was learning that lesson in real time, and it was breaking him in ways he'd never imagined possible. The business partners started pulling out first. Marcus Chun, who'd invested $20 million based on Elliot's reputation, called with devastating precision. I've reviewed the Gazette article and cross-referenced it with your public statements about family values. They don't align, Elliot. More importantly, I've discovered the hospital confrontation wasn't an isolated incident. People are coming forward with stories about your business practices, your treatment of employees, Your casual cruelty disguised as leadership. I'm withdrawing my investment and recommending others do the same. Elliot tried to salvage it, his voice taking on the commanding tone that usually bent people to his will. Marcus, you're making decisions based on tabloid journalism. That article was sensationalized, taken out of context. But Marcus cut him off with words that landed like physical blows. I spoke with 3 nurses who were in that delivery room, Elliot. I spoke with your own sister Caroline. The context makes it worse, not better. You forced a woman in active labor to sign divorce papers while your mistress watched. What context justifies that? The silence that followed was answer enough. When Marcus hung up, Elliot understood that his carefully constructed empire was collapsing not because of Emma's actions, but because of his own. She hadn't attacked him. She'd simply stopped protecting him from the consequences of his choices, and those consequences were catastrophic. His mother Margaret arrived at his office an hour later, her usual imperious bearing replaced by something that looked dangerously close to panic. The country club rescinded our membership, she said, without preamble. 40 years of membership gone. They cited conduct unbecoming, and mentioned that several members had expressed discomfort with our continued presence. Elliot stared at his mother, seeing her clearly for perhaps the first time. This is your fault, he said quietly. You pushed me to treat Emma like she was worthless. You brought Victoria into our lives. You orchestrated everything that's destroying us now. Margaret's face flushed with indignation. I was protecting this family's standards. Emma was beneath us, beneath you. She had no breeding, no connections, no worth beyond what we gave her. And now she has everything, Elliot said, his voice hollow. The money, the respect, the moral authority, the future. While we have nothing but the reputation we earned through cruelty. Have you ever watched someone realize they've destroyed their own life with their own hands? That's what was happening to Elliot Thompson, and the realization was annihilating him piece by piece. Margaret tried to argue, but Elliot wasn't listening anymore. He was thinking about the golden pen he'd used to force those divorce papers into Emma's hands, the symbol of power that had actually symbolized his complete moral bankruptcy. That pen was now Emma's, photographed and featured in the article as evidence of calculated cruelty. She'd kept it, not as a trophy, but as a reminder that power means nothing when it serves only ego. Victoria called 3 days later, her voice tight with barely controlled panic. Elliot, we need to talk about the situation. He almost laughed at her phrasing. The situation. As if their affair, his destroyed marriage, and his imploding life could be reduced to such antiseptic language. What situation, Victoria? The one where you're photographed in a hospital delivery room watching my wife sign divorce papers? Or the situation where every client I had is now reconsidering their association with me? Victoria's silence was brief. I never wanted this, she said finally. I thought you were separated, that the marriage was already over. You told me she knew about us, that she didn't care. Elliot closed his eyes, remembering the lies he'd constructed to justify his choices. She didn't know Victoria. She endured. There's a difference, and it's the difference between who I pretended to be and who I actually am. The worst came 2 weeks later when Grace's pediatrician, the same Dr. Sarah Chun who'd been Emma's advocate, called requesting a meeting. Elliot assumed it was about visitation arrangements, but when he arrived at her office, Sarah's expression was pure professional ice. Mr. Thompson, I'm obligated to inform you that given the documented circumstances around Grace's birth and your ongoing pattern of behavior, I'll be recommending supervised visitation only if you pursue custody. Elliot felt the world tilt. You can't do that. She's my daughter. Sarah pulled out a file thick with documentation. You forced her mother to sign legal documents during active labor while your mistress observed. You abandoned your wife in medical distress for your own convenience. These actions demonstrate judgment so poor that unsupervised access to an infant becomes a legitimate concern. She paused, then added with devastating calm, the nurses documented everything, Mr. Thompson. Every word, every action, every moment of cruelty. It's all here, and it all speaks to who you are when you have power over someone vulnerable. Robert Castellano, Emma's attorney, reached out with an unexpected offer that same week. My client wants you to know that she's not seeking to destroy you, Mr. Thompson. She's simply allowing the natural consequences of your actions to unfold. However, she's willing to discuss a path forward if you're interested in genuine accountability rather than image management. Elliot met Robert in a coffee shop far from anywhere they might be recognized. The attorney was younger than Elliot expected, with sharp eyes that missed nothing. What does she want? Elliot asked. Robert smiled slightly. That's the wrong question. The right question is, what do you want? Because Emma has already secured everything she needs: financial stability, legal protection for Grace, and a reputation built on integrity. You have nothing she wants, which means you have no leverage. But she believes in rehabilitation over destruction, so she's offering you a choice. He slid a folder across the table. Complete transparency about your business practices, public accountability for your actions, and genuine commitment to change. Do those things, and she won't oppose reasonable visitation with Grace as she grows older. Continue the path you're on, and she'll let you destroy yourself without interference. Elliot opened the folder, seeing documented evidence of every questionable business decision, every ethical compromise, every moment where he'd chosen profit over principle. She has all of this? Robert nodded. She's had it for years. Your wife was never the weak, helpless woman you imagined her to be. She was intelligent, observant, and strategic. She documented everything while you thought she was just enduring. That's why you lost, Mr. Thompson. You underestimated the person closest to you and overestimated your own invincibility. What would you do if you discovered that the person you'd spent 5 years destroying had actually been building the case for your downfall the entire time? Elliot sat there reading through years of his own arrogance made manifest, understanding finally that Emma's victory wasn't about revenge. It was about justice, the kind that doesn't need to shout because it's built on unshakable truth. Emma stood in the community center she'd funded with redirected Thompson money, watching children from neighborhoods the Thompson family had never visited learn music, art, and coding. Grace was 18 months old now, babbling happily in her stroller while pointing at colorful murals painted by local teenagers. This was what $75 million looked like when it served purpose instead of ego, not marble lobbies with bronze plaques, but spaces where actual transformation happened daily. A young woman approached Emma cautiously, recognition flickering in her eyes. You're her, aren't you? The woman from the article. Emma smiled gently. I'm Emma. And you are? The woman extended her hand, trembling slightly. I'm Jessica. I left my husband 6 months ago after reading your story. He wasn't as wealthy as yours, but the cruelty was the same. Seeing you survive it and build something beautiful afterward gave me permission to believe I could too. Emma took her hand, feeling the weight of what her pain had become, not just personal history, but catalyst for change in lives she'd never directly touched. How are you doing now? She asked. Jessica's eyes filled with tears, but her smile was genuine. I'm free. I'm scared sometimes and money is tight, but I'm free. And my daughters are learning that they don't have to accept cruelty just because it comes wrapped in promises. How many lives can one person's courage save when they refuse to hide their truth? Emma was discovering that number was far larger than she'd imagined. Each story, like Jessica's, a ripple extending from the stone she'd thrown into still water. The community center was just one manifestation of her mother's brilliant planning. There were 12 others across the city now, each located in areas the Thompson family had considered beneath their notice. Emma visited them all regularly, not for photo opportunities or recognition, but because seeing the direct impact of resources properly directed reminded her why the 5 years of endurance had mattered. Every child who learned to code might escape poverty. Every teenager who discovered art might avoid violence. Every mother who found legal resources might leave an abusive situation. This was legacy, not buildings bearing your name, but lives changed by your choices. Robert called with news that felt like the closing of a circle. Elliot signed everything. Full transparency about his business practices, public acknowledgement of his behavior, and commitment to therapy and accountability. He's also agreed to establish a foundation in Grace's name funded by his remaining assets, supporting women leaving abusive marriages. Emma absorbed this information carefully, looking for the manipulation she'd learned to expect from anything involving Elliot. What's his angle? Robert's laugh was dry. Self-preservation. He's smart enough to recognize that his only path to any kind of redemption runs through genuine change. Whether that change is real or performed doesn't matter much. The outcome serves people who need it. Emma thought about the man who'd held that golden pen in the delivery room, so certain of his power and her powerlessness. Does he want to see Grace? She asked. Robert hesitated. Eventually. He's not ready yet, and honestly, neither is his understanding of what fatherhood means. But he's asked that when the time comes, you let him try. Not for his sake, but for hers. Emma walked to the window, watching Grace play with blocks under the watchful eye of her nanny. Her daughter would grow up knowing her father existed, but understanding that biology doesn't equal entitlement to relationship. Tell him that Grace will decide when she's old enough to make that choice. I won't poison her against him, but I won't force connection either. If he becomes someone worthy of knowing her, she'll sense that. Children are better judges of character than adults give them credit for. She paused, then added something she hadn't planned to say. And Robert? Tell him I don't forgive him. Forgiveness isn't something he's earned or that I owe. But I don't hate him either. Hate would give him power he doesn't deserve. I simply recognize him as someone who made terrible choices and is now living with consequences. That's not my burden to carry anymore. When Robert hung up, Emma felt something shift inside her, not closure exactly, but the quiet recognition that Elliot's story and hers had finally separated into parallel lines that would never intersect again unless she chose it. Margaret Thompson's decline was swift and absolute. The woman who'd measured worth by social position discovered that position evaporates when built on cruelty rather than character. Her friends abandoned her with the same casual dismissal she'd once directed at Emma. Her influence in charitable circles disappeared overnight. Her own children, Caroline and Elliot, began setting boundaries she'd never had to respect before. Emma heard about it through various channels, but felt no satisfaction in Margaret's fall. There was simply the quiet recognition that people eventually become what they've always been. Margaret had always been cruel. And now she was cruel without the social armor that had protected her from consequences. Emma wondered sometimes if Margaret understood what she'd lost, or if she remained convinced that she'd been right and the world had simply become too soft to appreciate proper standards. Either way, it no longer mattered to Emma's life or peace. The first anniversary of Grace's birth arrived with unexpected emotion. Emma had planned a small celebration, just close friends, and the people who'd supported her through the darkest moments. Sarah Chun brought her husband and children. Robert came with his wife. Caroline attended hesitantly, still rebuilding trust through consistent actions rather than words. And Jessica, the young woman from the community center, arrived with her daughters and a card that read, "Thank you for showing us that survival isn't the end of the story. It's the beginning." As Emma held Grace and looked around at these people, none of them wealthy in Thompson terms, all of them rich in the ways that actually mattered, she felt her mother's presence almost physically. Every choice her mother had made, every document prepared, every legal mechanism established, had been an act of love reaching across time. "Happy birthday, Grace," Emma whispered, kissing her daughter's head. "You were born into cruelty, but you'll grow up surrounded by kindness. That's the victory your grandmother planned for, and it's the legacy I'll protect with everything I have." Later that evening, after everyone had left and Grace was asleep, Emma sat in her modest living room and did something she hadn't allowed herself during the years of abuse. She cried. Not from pain or grief, but from the overwhelming recognition that she'd survived something meant to destroy her and had transformed it into something that healed others. The tears felt like release, like the final letting go of the woman who'd walked through those iron gates believing humility would earn her belonging. That woman was gone, replaced by someone who understood that belonging isn't earned through submission, but claimed through clarity about your own worth. Emma had learned the hardest lesson life teaches, that sometimes the people who should love you will hurt you, and your only choice is whether that hurt defines you or refines you. She'd chosen refinement, and it had cost her everything she thought she wanted while giving her everything she actually needed. Have you ever realized that losing everything you thought mattered was actually gaining everything that does? Emma Thompson understood that paradox now in ways that transcended explanation. She had grace, healthy and happy, and growing up in a home where love wasn't conditional on performance. She had purpose, transforming millions into meaningful change rather than social positioning. She had peace, the deep kind that comes from knowing you survived your worst nightmare and built something beautiful from the ruins. And she had proof, undeniable and documented, that patience paired with intelligence could accomplish what force never could. The golden pen Elliot had wielded like a weapon sat in Emma's desk drawer now, not as a trophy, but as a reminder. Power means nothing when it serves only ego. Cruelty always has consequences, even when justice takes time. And the person you underestimate might be the one who changes everything. Emma closed her eyes, feeling the weight of her journey settle into wisdom rather than wounds. She'd won not by destroying her enemies, but by refusing to let their destruction of her succeed. She'd built a life where worth was measured by character, where power served purpose, and where the woman once dismissed as worthless proved priceless in every way that actually mattered. This was victory, quiet, unshakable, and infinitely more satisfying than revenge could ever be. And as Grace slept peacefully in the next room, Emma knew that her mother's greatest gift hadn't been the $75 million. It had been the belief that her daughter was strong enough to survive anything and wise enough to transform survival into triumph. That belief had been justified, and its legacy would echo through generations. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the story, make sure to subscribe to the channel and drop a comment telling us the part of the story you enjoyed most.